Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, there was no masking the disappointment this week as the COVID numbers showed disturbing increases, causing Phase 3 to be pushed back. Meanwhile, educators are still trying to figure out a schedule for the upcoming school year. Something else is in the air, that's dust plumes from storms in the Sahara. We'll look at the good and the bad of what to expect. Plus, we will hear about a multi-part series on race in New Orleans and what's being discovered. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources, LeBron Joseph, news anchor at WGNO-TV, Channel 26, Kevin McGill, reporter, The Associated Press, Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter, and Mark Schleifstein, environmental reporter, The Times-Picayune, The New Orleans Advocate. I'm going to go over to Kevin first, and this is a week of COVID news that we really did not want to be hearing. It's not going in the direction we'd like. So what did the governor tell us?
There were more disappointing numbers just today. We've reached 54,700 cases above that now. That's the second time this week that we've had an increase of more than 1,300 cases, and we've had several hundred other days this week. More cases doesn't necessarily mean that the virus is spreading, but we've also had a jump in hospitalizations. It hit 700. Now, it had peaked at close to 2,000 back in April, but it's steadily dropping. It hit down to around 540 back in, I think, early June. I think June 13th, it had been that low. Now it's up to 700 as of midday today. So that led to some concerns that led the governor to decide that we would not be going on to Phase 3 of the reopening. We'll stay at Phase 2. We'll be at Phase 2 for probably another 28 days. He did leave open the possibility that he might open up earlier than that, but that's going to be depending on what the numbers tell us. And so far, they're not very good. We're just seeing a possibility of greater spread, just like all across the nation right now.
Also, I'm hearing that we're seeing more numbers in younger people. And
that's kind of the time bomb aspect of this, because young people don't usually suffer as much from COVID-19. They're often asymptomatic. They don't get as sick. The greatest number of deaths occur among people 65, 70 and over. But as Dr. Jimmy Guidry, the state health officer, said earlier this week at a news conference, the young people get it, and eventually it's going to move to the more vulnerable among us, and that's the problem. There was a little bit of good news this week in that there had been, of course, some fears among all the protests in New Orleans for racial justice that all those people together in a large gathering might be a source of contagion spreading, and that has not been the case. The mayor and Dr. Jennifer Avegno both mentioned at the news conference on Wednesday that there were no indications of it. I talked with Dr. Joseph Cantor, the head of Region 1 for the health department, and he said so far no indications of a spread. And then we've had a good 2-week period since the height of the demonstrations, and we haven't seen that. That indicates two things that health experts have been saying for a long time. All gatherings are risky, but outdoor gatherings are safer than indoor gatherings. And it certainly appears that masks help stop the spread of the disease. I've talked to journalists who were on the scene during the protests, and they say that there was widespread use of masks, and Dr. Cantor and Dr. Avegno and the mayor all had alluded to that. And it does appear that may be a factor in stopping or preventing the spread from that type of large gathering.
Then what's driving these increases, which are being described as community spread?
Well, all over the country, states have been easing up on restrictions, and all over the country, we've been seeing numbers increase. We know that here in the New Orleans area and in Baton Rouge, for instance, health officials have been pointing to, in Baton Rouge, the Tigerland area, the college bars around there. I think Cantor told me about 100 cases were attributed to recent gatherings there. We know that there were at least a couple of dozen or more arising from graduation parties in the New Orleans area. Again, that explains also why we're seeing more cases among young people, and again, why the worry is that down the line, that could spread to the more vulnerable population. And as the governor also said, young people aren't invincible, especially if there are any underlying health conditions that they don't know
Right.
about. But again, the concern is older people and people with long-time health issues.
And our hospital capacity, our healthcare capacity, if we see the numbers rise, are we better prepared? Are they saying that we can handle this?
That's a long-term concern, but we are better prepared. Dr. Canner, I don't have specifics, but Dr. Canner was telling me yesterday that a lot of hospitals in Region 1, the New Orleans region, did build up and are better prepared to take an influx of patients. You still don't want to tax it. One of the side effects of COVID-19, even if you don't get it, the fact that a lot of people avoid going to hospitals where they put off doctors' visits. And it'll be a long time before we can measure this, but there's certainly a worry that because people may have put off going to an emergency room or going to see their doctor because they were concerned about COVID-19, concerned about catching it, or because of delays in availability of care, that's going to show up in mortality rates sooner or later.
So we're going to see more enforcement. So I know we heard from the mayor that if they see big crowds gathering, they're going to step in.
The mayor has talked about it. She even talked about a task force of state and local health officials and code enforcement officials in the fire marshal's office. The governor has said there will be a crackdown. I just saw in Baton Rouge today, Mayor Broome had said she's going to put up a phone number and a website where people can anonymously report violations. So there's a lot of concern that a crackdown is needed. On the other side, there are people who don't want to crack down and want the restrictions lifted. There has been a renewal of an effort in the state house, and we won't see where that goes until next week, to override the governor's emergency declaration.
Okay. Well, we'll see. Right now, though, they are urging that we wear masks because it just can protect us. I can protect you. You can protect me by wearing masks. But not everybody agrees with that. So, okay. Thanks a lot, Kevin. LeBron, we're going to move over to you. And certainly another big issue that we have here in our area and across the country is race. And you guys have, over there at Channel 26, you started a series of discussions about race in our city. And the first one aired a couple of weeks ago. You're about to launch another one. Tell us about it.
Well, certainly this all happens on the backdrop of, as you said, the protest and, the killing of George Floyd and everything else. But, we kind of put our heads together and decided what's the best way to move the conversation forward. And in effect, that is the name of the series, WGNO Forward, Race in Our City. And once the protests are done, once all of these other things are done, what do we do now? And I think part of it is painting the picture of what the issues really are, and trying to do it as diversely as possible, understanding that some of the things in our city that we deal with, environmental racism, or in our state and across the country, are going to be much more long-term things to have to deal with, or long-term fixes for them. One of the issues with COVID-19, as we were just talking about, is the disparate effects on African-American communities or on poor communities. That sort of crept up as well, and it's a healthcare issue, and that's a long-term issue as well. But there are others that, in a strange way, our city is kind of interesting because we've dealt with some of what the rest of the country is dealing with now, the statues issue. We dealt with that a few years ago, so that's not necessarily the big deal here. Policing, ironically, is something we dealt with a few years ago, not because we decided to be a great city and just all of a sudden have a great police department, but on the heels of what happened at Danziger and some of the other things that were happening in our city. We've been under that federal oversight. So our policing, certainly in Orleans Parish, has sort of addressed some of the things that the rest of the country is now beginning to deal with. So it's an interesting take, attempting to first look at some of the issues, but also how can we be better about some of this? How can we get to where we need to be? Another long-term issue would be that of housing. Spoke with Andronika Morris this week's show, which airs tomorrow, about some of the housing issues that we deal with here. Some of these things, Marcia, are related to economics. Many of them, one of the questions I had for Andronika was, it's kind of he who has the gold makes the rules. With a lot of this, when you're talking about housing and, who gets to live where and things like that, and not having that type of that type of asset of having the gold, if you will,
Right.
not being able to dictate where you want to live. She, however, sees it as a question of will and the will of the people of the city and how we want our citizens to live in certain ways. So it's a number of issues. It's a wide-ranging look at a number of the issues, but not only what they are, but how we can get to a better place with some of it.
And so you're really doing a series of conversations with a number of
Yes.
people, as you said, a diverse group of people representing our community. In doing these conversations, now you've just into your second show, and I know you guys plan to do more, which is great to have this conversation in the community. What are you taking away from it? What do you think you're discovering out of this?
Well, I think what I'm discovering, what I'm happy about, first of all, just as I said, is that our city has already addressed some of what is the issues what are the issues in the rest of the country. You know, our little sleepy New Orleans has already addressed some of this stuff. So that's a good thing. That's a very, very good thing. But the long game in some of this is going to be interesting, how we attack it, especially economic questions, because they not only involve race, but they involve class. They involve, when you bring up questions about our hospitality workers and all, you know, there's been, along with this racial discussion, it's been a discussion about, hang on a second, we're not being treated well either, you know, and how can we, this is the backbone of what is the biggest industry in our city, how do we help that situation along? So I am encouraged that we're having the talk. Some of these things will take generations to fix and get better. Others, much more quickly. Others happening as a result of the conversation just today. Mrs. Benson commits to change the name of Dixie Beer.
Right.
Who would have
Who
thought that would
that?
ever have happened? And to be honest, you know, part of why she and Mr. Benson bought that brand was to bring that history back into the city, not the history of the Old South or of, Whistling Dixie or any of that stuff, but the history of what that brand meant to so many people. To change that name or to commit to change that name is an interesting thing. All of them won't be that easy, if you will, if you look at it that way. But I also think that Mrs. Benson is a smart businesswoman. You know, Mrs. Benson owns a couple $1 billion worth of sports franchises with an entire roster of African Americans on each side, and I think it sends an incredible message. I think her brewery sits on the cusp of New Orleans East, which is the largest African American community in the city.
It's certainly a big move, no doubt about that. Okay, so your second show comes on, you say Saturday night.
Yes, it airs tomorrow. We talk about housing. We talk about health care with Dr. Thomas LaViste. We also talk about discrimination with Alana Odoms over at the ACLU.
All right. Good conversation. Keep it going.
Yes.
Community needs it. Thanks a lot, LeBron. Yes. All right, Mark, over to you. Something that we don't necessarily need, but we're getting anyway, is Herand Dust.
That's true. It's pretty odd situation where we have all of this dust that's blown up off of the coast of Africa, out of the Sahara Desert, and it's made its way across the Atlantic Ocean through the Caribbean and arrived last night along the Gulf Coast, the northern Gulf Coast. And it's made its way into New Orleans and the rest of the metro area, and also in levels that this morning were right up there to the point where there might have been some health effects for people who were sensitive groups, people with heart or lung problems, older adults, children, teens, all their exposure to the dust at its worst. On the western side of the state, it was even worse than that. It was at levels that were basically could affect anybody. And that dust is now making its way all the way up to Shreveport to the in levels for sensitive people. So it's something that's going to stick around for another day or so, at least a little bit of it here. It'll drop off for a little while, and then in about a week, we're going to have another batch of it arrive again, although it doesn't look like it'll be quite as bad as this time.
Good news is that if I guess if it's not rainy as we've had, you can get a beautiful sunset out of it. But even better is it suppresses storm development, right?
That's true. This, you have to remember that this dust is basically entrained in an upper level layer of very dry air, and that dry air really disrupts the ability of thunderstorms to form, unless you have a situation like yesterday and early this morning where you had thunderstorms that were already set up, and so the dust was arriving inside them. But usually it'll just take the heart out of the thunderstorms because there's so much dry air. Plus, the amount of dust actually reduces water temperatures below it a little bit, tiny bit. So that also is a way of reducing potential for storms to grow.
So do we see this dust kind of settling on our cars, as you can, during the time when pollen settles, you have yellow cars suddenly, but is this dust settling on us also?
Yeah, if you had put out a white bucket yesterday before the rainstorms came and then let the water evaporate away, you'd probably see a layer of dust at the bottom.
So you're breaking up a little bit, Mark. So you'd have a little bit of the Sahara in your backyard then, huh? If you did that bucket experiment.
Absolutely. In fact, in South Florida, there's an area called the Redwoods that actually was a prehistoric layer of this dust that is now the area the best farmland in South Florida.
All right.
Yeah.
So it definitely has some benefits then. All right. Thanks a lot, Mark. Yeah. Dawn, over to you. Parents all over are wondering what is going to happen with this school year. Are we any clearer on it now?
Sort of is the best answer I can give you. The school year is scheduled to start in roughly 6 weeks in the New Orleans area, depending on what school system you're looking in. The state came out with its recommendations yesterday. So now all of the various districts are figuring out what their specific plans are. But the state didn't mandate several things. One is mask wearing wherever possible for students in third grade and older. I think that the science is showing that the littler, tinier kids, A, can't wear masks well or easily, B, can't learn well because they need mouths for phonics and things and learning phonics and learning how to read and write, and C, they don't transmit as much as older children do. So they won't need to be masked, but the older kids will. They'll also recommend temperature checks for everybody, with people who are at 100.4 or higher being banned from going to school and being forced to quarantine, frequent hand washing, and then all of those phases the state's in affect the schools as well. If we were knocked back into phase 1, the groups in schools would have to be 10 people or less, including a teacher. Currently in phase 2, we're at 25 people, can go up to 50 in phase 3. So all the schools now are working on what their specific plans regarding those recommendations will look like. Orleans Parish is expected to come out with its recommendations sometime next week. The leaders of the New Orleans Archdiocese and all of the Catholic schools are meeting actually right now, trying to figure out how school will look going forward for them. The independent school leaders are consulting with the state as well. And then you wrap in the State Department of Health, Ochsner Health Systems, LCMC Health. They're all consulting with the schools and trying to figure out what works. What is it going to end up looking like is probably a very large hybrid model where you have some schools that are entirely distance learning. You have other schools that are in school but have distance learning as a part of it. I've heard in other states, nobody here is talking about platooning yet, but in other states, if you'll hear me out on this so it makes sense, you'll have 3 different groups. One group would be strictly virtual and not go to school at all. One group would go to school on Mondays and Tuesdays. Schools would be closed entirely except for virtual on Wednesdays so they could be cleaned. And the other group would go on Thursday and Friday. So there is always time for cleaning and always smaller groups and always virtual learning happening as well. The real answer, Marcia, is nobody is exactly sure what school's going to look like, and it's 6 weeks away. So there will be a lot of announcements coming out next week, both from Orleans Parish schools, the Archdiocese schools, the independent schools, as well as the other parishes. The recommendations just came down from the state late yesterday afternoon. So there's a lot of meeting and thinking happening, and with the numbers ticking up, that there are questions about, well, if we have a positive test, do we have to shut the school down every time somebody has a positive test, and then for how long? So those answers are all still being worked out.
A major challenge, I know, a big challenge, and also there's the issue of transportation, buses. How do you make that work?
In phase 2, buses are limited to one child in every other seat. So I don't know how you ever get all the kids to school. Kids from the same family or home setting can sit together. In phase 1, busing doesn't really happen at all. So the hope would be that we go to phase 3, but we won't know that until so close to the school year starting that it makes it really challenging to plan.
It's so hard for the parents to figure out what they're going to do. I mean, it impacts their work schedule.
It impacts their work schedule. And then the big thing that's also out there, the big elephant in the room, is the mental health of these kids. I was speaking with a pediatrician this week who said they are very much seeing signs of kids really being very distraught. They're not meant to operate in solo environments. Kids really need their peers, both for learning and for just socialization. And they're not around them in groups like they might want to be or need to be. So there's got to be a balance in there somewhere that keeps the community safe, but keeps the kids mentally safe too.
So we're still on target for August, like the beginning of August.
Second week of August for most schools.
But we have to see how.
Some schools in our area.
Go ahead.
Some schools have moved up their start date to earlier in August, but we're still on target for now.
Right. Okay, Don, I guess we'll just have to wait and see how things play out. Thanks a lot. And Mark, we're going to go back over to you because with everything that is going on, and there has been so much that's been going on, we still have a coast that's imperiled. So how are we looking? We hear reports coming out saying we're doomed, and other ones saying, well, no, wait a minute, we're working on it. We can handle this. What are we seeing? What's the status now?
So the reality is that we are now at a point where our for years our coast, the biggest factor in terms of the loss of wetlands was largely subsidence, the natural and unnatural sinking of our coast for a variety of different reasons. Now, sea level rise pushed by global warming has become more and more a major impact. And that's going to increase over the next couple of centuries. And the potential is so how do we deal with that? And there was indeed a research paper that showed that in as quick as 50 years, but more likely 100 years or 200 years out, a significant chunk of the remaining wetlands will disappear. So the question is, what do you do about that? Well, the biggest thing that you can do is reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's a program that he is starting now to try to identify ways that Indiana can reduce their emissions in ways that might affect it. It's still only even though Louisiana is maybe fourth or fifth nationwide in the amount of greenhouse gases produced, worldwide, it's still just barely a small piece of the problem. This really is a worldwide problem to try to rescind part of that. In the meantime, what the state is doing is that they're moving forward with things like the major sediment diversions and a variety of different projects to directly rebuild wetlands by mining the Mississippi River for sediment and pumping it to actually build new wetlands.
So the state is proceeding with the master plan.
Absolutely,
that's been laid out.
It's spending now. It's on track now to spend $1 billion a year over the next 10 years. So it's quite a bit.
You know what I think was interesting with this lockdown around the world, really, we saw cities that had been so heavily polluted, we were able to see skylines again, see the sky clear because cars and trucks, et cetera, are not on the roads anymore.
That's true, but it's short-lived.
Yeah.
And the reality is that once, especially with back into the into the realm of when the COVID reduced on their economy is going to be booming again, and they are, they're still the biggest user of oil, natural gas, and coal in the world, and that's going to be a continued problem.
So here in the Louisiana area, we still have to sort of keep the faith that we can at least mitigate some of these losses that are being forecast.
Yes, absolutely. It stall the time frame for when it occurs. At least get us past the next 50 years, and maybe by then something will actually be happening about climate change.
Because some of those maps can be pretty scary when you see the Gulf of Mexico lapping on the shores of Baton Rouge, and everything below it is open water.
That's very true, and we will see significant losses over the next 50 years, no matter what.
Okay, Mark. All right. It is time now for all of you guys to talk about something personal, and that is, what is the restriction that really bothers you the most that we're going through right now? And we're going to start with LeBron. Let's go over to you.
I don't know about bothered, but I know the one that I have the most difficulty, is the mask. And not because I don't want to wear one, it's because it fogs up my glasses.
Yeah, it
Wherever
does.
I go.
It does, doesn't it?
It fogs up my glasses. And then I caught myself the other night running in Walmart to hurry up and grab something, and then running right out, and I forgot to have the mask on, and people were looking at me like I was crazy. And I'm like, I come into one place where sick people come to get medicine, and I don't wear the mask. But that's the one.
I know, but I know they definitely can fog up glasses, but we got to wear them.
That's exactly right.
It does help. Okay, Kevin, yours.
I think under the heading of you don't know what you miss until you can't have it, live music is still a restriction here in New Orleans. And I will start thinking back on times when I would go down to Frenchman Street and see John Boutet at DBA, or just walk down Bourbon Street and hear live music from cover bands. It's just something that and I've been craving ever since. I watched a fundraiser for Preservation Hall on YouTube Saturday night, and it's got us in my household wishing we could get back down there again. So I think live music. I'm not going into restaurants either, but that's a self-imposed restriction right now. But the live music ban is really a problem.
And musicians miss you. We know that too. Okay, Dawn, quickly, what's yours?
I've got to agree with LeBron on the masks. For me, it's not glasses. I'm just realizing that we all communicate far better with our mouths than we do with our eyes, and it's really hard to understand how people are thinking or feeling when you only see their eyeballs.
Right. Okie doke. All right, Mark, we wrap up with you.
I'll have to say it has to do with religion. I'm on the board of my synagogue, and we are struggling to try to figure out what to do about the high holidays in September, which are likely going to be live streamed rather than in person for all but a handful of people.
All these big changes for us right now. All right, guys, including y'all being far away. But it's good to see you all. Thanks so much for joining us. All right. And thank you all for joining us, too. We'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening. Thanks, guys.